The call came on a Tuesday morning in February, while I was standing in my driveway with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched yet, watching the neighbor's dog tear up the flower bed like he had a personal vendetta against tulips. My phone rang, an 800 number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Mr. Reeves, this is Janet calling from Third Federal Bank. I'm reaching out regarding some recent activity on a joint account ending in 4417. Sir, are you aware that approximately $47,000 has been withdrawn from this account over the past 8 weeks? No, I told her I was not aware of that. The withdrawals were authorized. They were made by a Miles Reeves, who is listed as a joint account holder. My son. There's one more thing I need to flag, Mr. Reeves. About 3 weeks before the first withdrawal, Miles added a second authorized user to the account, a woman named Priya Khatri. We have no other information on file for this individual. I'm calling to confirm that you authorized these changes. I hadn't. I didn't know anyone named Priya Khatri, and I hadn't spoken to my son in 6 months. Let me tell you what that particular Tuesday morning felt like. I was 41 years old, standing in my own driveway in Columbus, Ohio, in a fleece jacket I'd owned for 15 years, and the cold that went through me had nothing to do with the weather. It was the specific cold of realizing the person you thought you knew, the person you raised, the person whose entire life you could trace from first breath to first steps to first day of school, had become a stranger overnight. I want to be honest about what my mind did in the seconds after that call ended, because this is the part I'm not proud of, and because it matters that you understand the state I was in when everything that followed happened. My mind went straight to the worst version of the story, $47,000, a woman nobody could account for, 6 months of total silence. The math assembled itself without my permission. My son had helped himself to money that was partly mine, a joint account I'd kept open since he was 19 for emergencies, and he'd shared that access with a woman I'd never heard of, and he'd done all of it while refusing to return a single one of my calls. I drove to his apartment on the east side of Columbus that morning with my hands tight on the wheel and a hot humming anger in my chest that I mistook for certainty. I had convinced myself, somewhere on I-70, that I already knew what this was, that I already knew what he was. I was wrong about every single part of it. But I didn't know that yet, and before I can tell you what I found when I got home that afternoon, the thing that took everything I thought I understood and turned it completely inside out, I have to tell you who Miles is and who we were to each other, because that's the only way this story makes any sense. My name is Colton Reeves. I run a mid-sized residential and commercial contracting company out of Columbus called Reeves & Sons Construction, a name I chose partly out of ambition and partly out of a quiet hope that my son would eventually want to be part of it. I built the company from essentially nothing over 14 years. It is the thing I am most proud of professionally, and Miles, who is 24, is the thing I'm most proud of, period, without exception, though I didn't always make sure he knew it. Miles is sharp, sharper than me, honestly, and I've always known it. He went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship, studied business and finance, graduated 2 years ago with a clearer understanding of how money moves than I've accumulated in 2 decades of running a company. He worked summers at Reeves & Sons all through college, not because I pushed him, but because he wanted to understand how the operation functioned from the ground up. He would sit with the books in the evenings and ask questions that occasionally embarrassed me because I didn't have good answers. He is careful where I am impulsive, patient where I am restless. He inherited his mother's ability to see a situation from 3 different angles before saying anything out loud, which is a gift I have never had. My ex-wife Sharon used to say that Miles was the best of both of us, filtered through a brain that actually works, and she meant it as a compliment to him, and she was right. Which is exactly why what happened between us 7 months ago still stings the way it does. The argument, when it finally came, was about the company. Miles had been reviewing the books. I'd given him more access over the summer, thinking about the future, and he came to me one Sunday evening with a printed spreadsheet and a look on his face that I didn't like. He said the numbers didn't add up, vendor payments going out that he couldn't match to any jobs, material invoices with quantities that didn't line up with project records, billing that seemed to lag in ways that created convenient gaps. He said he thought someone had unauthorized access to the accounts and that we needed to bring in an outside accountant right away. I told him he was wrong. I want to be honest about why I reacted the way I did, because it wasn't pure stubbornness, though there was some of that. There was also something else. The person who helped with the books, the person with informal access to the company accounts, the person Miles was pointing at without saying his name, was my older brother Dean. Dean had been woven into Reeves & Sons since nearly the beginning, not as an official employee, but as the kind of presence that accumulates in a family business. The person who helps out, who runs errands, who you trust with your passwords and your account login because he's your brother, and you've known him your whole life. He'd had hard years of his own, and I'd folded him into the edges of the company the way you do with family, quietly, without ceremony, without contracts or oversight, because that's not how family works, or so I believed. When Miles stood in my kitchen and told me something didn't add up, my first instinct, the one I am ashamed of now, was to protect Dean, to protect the idea that my brother would never do that to me. The argument escalated. I said things I shouldn't have. I told Miles he was seeing problems that weren't there, that he was playing accountant with knowledge he didn't fully have. I told him if he couldn't trust the people who'd helped build this company, maybe he needed to step back from being involved with it at all. He looked at me for a long moment, very still, very quiet. Then he said, "Okay, Dad," in a tone that had nothing agreeable in it, and he left. That was 7 months ago. He didn't come back. He didn't answer my calls. He moved to an apartment across town and went completely silent, and I told myself it was the stubbornness of a 24-year-old who couldn't handle being corrected. Underneath that, I was angrier than I was willing to admit, because it felt like he had chosen being right over being family. Now add a Tuesday morning bank call, and you understand the state of mind I brought to that drive across Columbus. His apartment was empty. I mean that literally. When the building manager let me in after some convincing and a flash of my ID, there was almost nothing there. A mattress on the floor, a few boxes in a corner. The kitchen had been cleaned out. It looked like someone who had been planning to be somewhere else for a while. I drove home in a silence that was almost loud, and the story my brain had been building all morning was by that point finished. Miles had taken money from our joint account and disappeared. He'd brought a woman I'd never heard of into it. The argument about the books had been his way of creating distance before he did it. That was the narrative. It fit every fact I had, and I had given it permission to become certainty somewhere on the highway between his apartment and mine. And then I got home and found the envelope. It was a padded mailer, brown, taped to my front door, no stamp, no return address, my name in Miles's handwriting, just Dad written in black marker. Inside's a USB drive and a single index card. 5 words in his handwriting: "Watch this before you decide." I almost didn't. I want to be honest about that. There was a part of me, the part that had been stewing for 6 months and had just gotten a phone call about $47,000, that wanted to throw the thing in a drawer and call my lawyer. I was tired, I was hurt. I had already made up my mind. But I plugged it in. The first file was a folder labeled Reeves & Sons Documentation. I opened it and started reading, and what I found in those first few minutes was enough to stop my hand on the mouse. Spreadsheets, financial records, a detailed side-by-side comparison between the company's official accounts and a parallel set of transactions going back nearly 3 years. Vendor payments routed to accounts with no matching business name. Material billings inflated by 10, 15, sometimes 20%, with the excess siphoned off in amounts small enough to never trigger automatic flags. A pattern of irregular transfers, never large, always spaced out, always camouflaged as operational noise, that added up across 34 months to just over $190,000. I am not a detail-oriented financial person. I run jobs, I manage crews and timelines and client expectations. I know what a project costs and I know what it should earn, and I trusted the space in between to my brother. Which is why my brother Dean had been able to steal from me for nearly 3 years without my noticing, but my son had noticed. There was a second folder labeled Legal. Inside it were documents from an attorney, a woman named Priya Khatri, a business fraud specialist at a firm in downtown Columbus, a Reitner agreement, case notes, a draft civil complaint, and a cover letter from Priya confirming that they had sufficient documented evidence to proceed and that she was ready to file whenever Miles gave the word. The $47,000 Miles had withdrawn from our joint account was her retainer fee. He had used our money to hire the lawyer who was going to go after the man who had stolen our money. I sat at my kitchen table without moving for a long time. And then I opened the third file. It was a video. Miles sitting at what looked like a library table, filming on a laptop camera in bad overhead lighting, wearing a gray hoodie. He looked thin, he looked tired in a way I hadn't seen on his face before. He looked at the camera for a moment before he started talking, like he was deciding exactly how to begin. He said, "Hey Dad, if you're watching this, then the bank probably called you. You're probably angry. I get that. I need you to listen anyway." He spent the next 12 minutes telling me everything. He had first noticed something wrong in the accounts more than a year before he came to me. He'd spent weeks trying to convince himself it was bookkeeping errors, normal inefficiency, something with an innocent explanation. He'd eventually built the full comparison between project records and financial outflows and accepted that there wasn't one. By the time he sat down with me that Sunday evening, he had already spent 2 months trying to figure out what to do with what he'd found. He'd come to me first because he'd hoped I would hear him. When I shut him down, when I chose my brother's reputation over my son's evidence, he understood that conversation wasn't going to work, that I would need proof I couldn't argue with, and the only way to get that proof was to bring in someone with the legal authority to obtain it without tipping anyone off. He said, "I know you're angry about the money, Dad. You have every right to be. I used the joint account because I had no way to pay for this without you knowing. Any charge you had visibility into, you would have seen and asked about, and then it would have all fallen apart before we had enough. I should have asked you, I know that, but every dollar I spent was to protect something you spent your whole adult life building. I didn't steal from you. I used what we had to try to save what you have." He paused and looked directly at the camera, and what was on his face in that pause wasn't defiance or anger. It was something quieter and much harder to sit with. He said, "The person who actually stole from you is documented in that first folder. Nearly 3 years, Dad. Uncle Dean has been doing this for nearly 3 years. Everything is there, the accounts, the amounts, the shell vendor he created to route it. Priya has everything she needs to move forward. All she needs is your authorization. Please call me. I know you're angry and I know I owe you an explanation I should have given you months ago, but please call me before you do anything else." The video ended. I want to tell you about the minutes that followed because they were some of the strangest of my life. I sat at that kitchen table with the laptop screen frozen on my son's face, and I felt the story I had built over the past 8 hours simply come apart. Not slowly. All at once, like a structure that had been leaning against something that was no longer there. Every piece of the last 7 months rearranged itself. The argument, not a kid throwing his weight around. He'd been trying to protect me. The silence afterward, not stubbornness. He couldn't tell me what he was doing without compromising everything. The empty apartment. He'd stepped back somewhere I couldn't reach him while he finished what he'd started, because he knew that if I found him too early, I would blow the whole thing up the same way I'd blown it up the first time. And while I'd been sitting on the other side of that silence, nursing 7 months of injured pride, certain I'd been wronged, my son had been quietly, methodically, at enormous personal cost to our relationship, building the case that would save the company I'd spent my entire adult life creating. I called him 3 times before he picked up. When he answered, he didn't say hello, he just said, "Did you watch it?" I told him yes. Silence on the line. "Then are you okay?" "Not do you believe me, not I told you so." He asked if I was okay. I told him I was not. I told him I was sitting at my own kitchen table feeling like something had come loose inside me that I didn't know how to put back. And then I told him the only thing I was certain of in that moment, which was that I needed him to come home. He came home that evening, thinner than I'd seen him in years, tired in a way that sat in his eyes even when he wasn't saying anything. We sat at the same table where we'd had the argument, and I told him everything I should have said the first time, that he had been right, that I had chosen my brother's reputation over my own son's evidence, and that I had been wrong to do it, and that the months of silence had cost him more than they ever should have, and that I was sorry. Miles listened the way he always does, completely still, taking in every word. When I finished, he said something I've thought about many times since. He said, "Dad, I know why you didn't believe me. Dean was there when Mom left. He's been in your corner for 30 years. Of course you defended him. I'm not angry that you did. I'm just glad I had time to get you something you couldn't argue with." I had to look away from him when he said that, because underneath the spreadsheets and the legal filings and all the evidence, there was still a grief in me for the brother I'd thought I had. Dean had been part of my life longer than almost anyone. He'd been there through my divorce, through the lean years of building the company, through every hard thing I'd faced as a grown man, and somewhere underneath the relief, there was a long, hollow ache for a friendship that apparently had never been what I'd believed it was. Miles saw it. He put his hand on my arm and said, "I know," and left it at that because there wasn't anything else to say. What followed moved quickly and cleanly, which is the way things move when someone has done the preparation work properly. We filed the civil complaint the following week. My attorney told me on the first call that she'd rarely seen documentation this thorough for a case of this kind. Miles had not only traced the outgoing funds but had identified the accounts where Dean had moved the money, discovered a connection to a private loan Dean had been servicing for years, and established that he'd used a shell vendor to systematically siphon money from Reeves and Sons to cover debts I'd known nothing about. The DA's office picked up the criminal referral. Dean is facing serious charges. I saw my brother once after everything came to light before attorneys got involved and communications went dark. He called from an unfamiliar number. I answered by accident. We both just sat there for a moment and I waited for him to have something to say. An explanation, a justification, some story that made him the wronged party. He didn't offer one. He said my name, and I could hear in his voice something I hadn't expected. Not defiance, something smaller, something worn down. I said, "Dean, I can't talk to you," and I ended the call. I want to be honest about what I felt afterward because I know the expected feeling in a story like this is rage. The rage was there, But it wasn't alone. There was also a long, quiet grief for the version of my brother I had believed in, the man who'd shown up when my marriage fell apart, who'd helped me hang drywall at 2 in the morning on my first real job, who'd been at every Thanksgiving and every birthday for decades. That person had been real to me. He just hadn't been the complete truth of who Dean was. And trying to hold both of those things at the same time is a particular kind of hard that I'm still learning to manage. Miles is back at Reeves & Sons now. He has a real title, CFO, and a real salary and a clean set of controls on the accounts. He brought in new accounting software and an external auditing firm for quarterly reviews, and he did all of it without making me feel like I was being managed or corrected. That is his specific gift. He does things the right way without making the people around him feel small for not having done them sooner. There is something good and a little strange about working alongside him now. We talk more than we ever did before. We actually finish our disagreements instead of letting them turn into silences that harden into something else. I know him differently than I did before all of this, not because he's changed, but because I am finally paying the kind of attention I should have been paying all along. Here is what I keep coming back to, and I'll try to say it plainly. For 7 months, I looked at my son's absence and read it as abandonment. I read the unreturned calls as disrespect. I read the silence as proof that he had decided I wasn't worth the effort. Every reading was wrong. The absence was him working. The silence was him protecting me from a confrontation I would have blown. The distance he put between us was exactly the distance he needed to do something enormous on my behalf without my interference. And while I sat on the other side of that wall, certain I'd been wronged, my son was fighting for me in a room I couldn't see, at a cost to himself I didn't understand until he handed me a USB drive with 5 words on an index card. I nearly let my anger make a permanent decision about a temporary silence. If I had called a lawyer that Tuesday morning instead of watching that video, I don't know where Miles and I would be right now. Everything he had done, the months of quiet, meticulous, lonely work, would have come to nothing. And I would have dismantled my relationship with the one person in my life who had gone furthest to protect it. So here is what I want to leave you with, because I think it's worth saying slowly. When someone you love does something that looks, on the surface, like betrayal, like taking without asking, like going quiet, like disappearing, before you let that story finish writing itself, consider that you might be missing the second half, the half that hasn't been able to show itself yet. The people who love you are not always able to explain what they're doing while they're doing it. Sometimes the fight that looks like walking away is actually someone running toward the thing that's threatening you. Sometimes the silence isn't absence. Sometimes it's the sound of someone carrying a weight so you won't have to. Give the people who've earned your trust, the people whose history with you has been steady and true, enough grace to wait for the whole picture before you render a verdict. My son earned that grace many times over in the months I spent, convinced he was the one who'd let me down. I just couldn't see it yet. I'll ask you this, because I do read these. Have you ever written someone off before you had the whole story? Before you found out what was actually happening on the other side of that wall? I'd like to hear about it below, because I know from where I'm standing now that you're not alone in it. And if there's someone in your life right now that you've been quietly judging from a distance, that might be worth one more look before you decide. That's all I've got tonight. I'll see you at the next one.